Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a hillside. Not a battlefield, not a monument, not a museum exhibit behind glass. A hillside, green and rolling, mist still clinging to the valleys below, the air carrying the smell of wood smoke and warm earth. And rising from somewhere on that hill, a sound. Human voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, woven together in harmonies so deep and so layered that you feel them in your chest before your mind has time to process what you are hearing. That sound is not a performance. It is not staged for a camera or a tourist audience. It is a people speaking to their ancestors. It is a civilization, ancient, complex, and very much alive, reminding itself of who it is and where it came from. This is the story of the Zulu Nation, not the war story, not the spears against rifles headline that textbooks reduced them to. The real story, the full story, the one that begins long before any battle was ever fought, with a people, a land, and a way of living so rich and so deeply human that it deserves every minute of your attention. Let's go. To understand the Zulu people, you must first understand the land that shaped them. Because in Zulu culture, land and identity are not two separate things. They are the same conversation. The region we today call KwaZulu-Natal sits on the eastern edge of southern Africa, a dramatic landscape of steep green hills, deep river valleys, and a coastline where the warm Indian Ocean meets the shore with a permanence that feels, somehow, intentional. The name KwaZulu itself means the place of the Zulu, a name that did not always exist, but that feels, once you know it, like it could never have been called anything else. The terrain here is generous in a way that much of the African continent is not. Annual rainfall is reliable enough to sustain grass, and grass means cattle. And cattle, in this world, was everything. It is impossible to overstate what cattle meant to the Nguni-speaking peoples of this region, of whom the Zulu were one grouping among many. Cattle were not simply food or farm animals in the Western agricultural sense. They were currency, but that word is too cold and too transactional for what they actually represented. Cattle were relationship. A herd measured a man's standing in his community, his ability to provide lobola for marriage negotiations, his capacity to host ceremonies, his generosity or lack thereof. A family's cattle were known individually, named, recognized, remembered across generations. To give a man cattle was to give him trust. To take a man's cattle was to take something that no simple ledger could ever fully account for. The rivers of this region, the Thukela, the White Mfolozi, the Black Mfolozi, the Mhlatuzi, divided the landscape into natural territories that different clans occupied and moved between, according to season and need. These waterways were not just geographic features. They were boundaries, meeting points, ceremonial sites, and sources of the clean water that sustained both people and livestock. The Zulu understood their rivers the way you understand a relative, with familiarity, respect, and a knowledge of their changing moods. The vegetation shifted as you moved through the territory. Near the coast, subtropical forests. Moving inland, open grassland. The highveld, that stretched in every direction under a sky so wide it could feel, on certain mornings, like the world had no edges. Higher still, the Drakensberg, the Dragon's Mountains, rose along the western horizon, a dramatic wall of basalt and sandstone that marked the boundary between the Nguni coastal world and the Sotho-speaking peoples of the interior plateau. Each ecological zone produced different resources, different grasses for different cattle, different plants for medicine and building, different clay for pottery. The Zulu people developed an intimate knowledge of this landscape across generations, not as scientists categorizing specimens, but as communities whose physical survival depended on reading the land the way you read a face, noticing every small shift and knowing what it meant. The seasons organized life in a way that no external authority needed to enforce. Summer, Hlobo, brought rain and planting. Winter, Ubusika, brought cold nights and the movement of cattle to lower grazing grounds. The agricultural calendar was not a written document. It was encoded in ceremony, in the timing of rituals, in the songs that women sang at planting time and harvest time, in the knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter as naturally as breathing. The Nguni-speaking world that the Zulu inhabited before the 19th century was not a world of large centralized kingdoms. It was a world of hundreds of relatively small, relatively autonomous clans, each with its own chief, its own territory, its own cattle routes and ceremonial sites. These clans were linked by language, by shared cultural practices, by intermarriage and trade. They competed, negotiated, and occasionally fought. But the competition was bounded, contained within a shared understanding of what was acceptable and what was not. The Zulu, at the beginning of the 19th century, were one of the smaller clans in this network. Their territory sat in the valley of the White Mifolozi River. Their population numbered perhaps in the hundreds. Their chief was a man of modest regional influence named Senzangakona. Nobody in 1800 would have looked at the Zulu clan and predicted what was coming. The land had been quietly preparing them for centuries. The rivers had taught them patience. The cattle had taught them relationship. The wide grassland had taught them to see far and move fast. The Drakensberg on the horizon had reminded them, every single morning, that the world was larger than whatever was immediately in front of them. They were ready, though they did not yet know it, for a transformation that no one in southern Africa could have imagined. If you could step back through time and walk toward a Zulu homestead on an ordinary morning, not a ceremonial day, not a day of conflict, just an ordinary sunrise in the early 19th century, what would you find? You would smell it before you saw it. Wood smoke, first. Then the warm, living smell of cattle. Then something underneath both of those. The fermented, slightly sour scent of amasi, curdled milk sitting in a gourd, doing what it had been doing for days, slowly becoming one of the most important foods in the Zulu diet. The homestead itself, the umuzi, would appear to you as a circle. Not approximately circular, deliberately, precisely circular. A collection of domed beehive huts arranged in an arc around a central cattle enclosure called the isibaya. That cattle enclosure was not just a practical pen. It was the spiritual heart of the homestead. The ancestors were believed to reside there, close to the cattle they had loved in life, present in the daily rhythms of feeding and milking and the soft sounds of animals settling for the night. The huts themselves, izindlu, singular indlu, were extraordinary pieces of architecture. Built without a single nail or metal fastening, they were constructed from a framework of flexible saplings bent and woven into a dome shape, then layered with grass thatch so precisely applied that a well-built indlu could shed rain completely. The entrance was low, deliberately so. You had to bow to enter. Whether this was purely practical, protecting the interior from wind and rain, or whether it carried a deeper meaning about humility at the threshold of home, the Zulu themselves understood it as both. Inside, the floor was hardened earth, polished smooth with a mixture of clay and cattle dung that dried to a surface almost like stone, cool in summer, holding warmth in winter. Sleeping mats were woven from river reeds. Carved wooden headrests kept hair, elaborately dressed and maintained, from being crushed during sleep. Storage pots, milk gourds, and cooking vessels were arranged with a specificity that reflected the social organization of the family. Nothing was placed randomly. Every position in a Zulu homestead meant something. The layout of the umuzi followed a social map. The senior wife's hut sat at the top of the arc, directly opposite the entrance. The huts of junior wives arranged themselves in a hierarchy that everyone understood without needing it explained. The umuzi was not just a place to sleep. It was a three-dimensional diagram of the family's social structure. Walk through it, and you could read the relationships without asking a single question. Now consider what people ate. Cattle were too valuable to slaughter casually. They were killed for ceremonies, for significant guests, for moments that warranted the weight of their sacrifice. But cattle gave daily, quietly, through milk. Amasi, fermented milk, was the cornerstone of the Zulu diet. It was thick, sour, nutritious, and present at almost every meal. Fresh milk, ubisi, was consumed as well but often reserved for children and the elderly. Uphuthu, a crumbly, dry porridge made from ground sorghum or maize, was eaten daily, often with amasi on the side. Sorghum beer, utshwala, was brewed by women and played a role far beyond simple refreshment. It was present at every ceremony, every negotiation, every gathering where community decisions were made. To offer someone utshwala was to offer them belonging. To refuse it, in certain contexts, was a social statement that could not be easily walked back. Vegetables were grown in gardens tended primarily by women. Pumpkins, sweet potatoes, leafy greens gathered from the surrounding bush. Meat from smaller animals, goats, chickens, wild game, supplemented the diet. The Zulu were not hunters primarily, but the land around them was generous with impala, warthog, and birds when the season called for it. Clothing in daily life was practical, beautiful, and deeply coated with social meaning. Men wore animal skin aprons, front and back, with the quality and type of skin reflecting status. Warrior regiments had specific decorative elements, feathers, fur, beadwork arrangements, that identified their unit to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Women wore isidwaba skirts of softened leather, their upper bodies and hairstyles changing with marital status in ways that the community read as easily as a spoken announcement. Married women covered their upper bodies and wore their hair in elaborate styles that signaled their new status. Unmarried girls wore their hair differently. Widows made specific adjustments to their dress that communicated grief and transition. In a world without written records, the body itself was the document. Clothing and hair and beadwork told your story to everyone who passed you on the path. Children moved through the homestead freely, close to adults, absorbing the rhythms of daily life through proximity rather than formal instruction. A girl of 7 understood how to carry water without spilling it, how to tend a fire, how to greet an elder with the correct level of deference. A boy of the same age knew the names of every cow in the family herd and could read their behavior well enough to know when something was wrong. This knowledge was not taught in sessions. It was lived, absorbed through the skin, as natural as the language itself. By midday, the homestead was fully alive, the sound of pestles grinding grain, the low conversation of women working side by side, the distant shouts of boys with cattle on the hillside, the smell of something cooking, and underneath it all, always, the cattle, present, central, irreplaceable, standing in the Isibaya at the heart of everything, as they had always stood, connecting the living to the land and the land to the ancestors who had worked it before. This was an ordinary day, not a special one, and it was, in its own quiet way, something really special. There is a version of Zulu history that gets told over and over, in textbooks, in documentaries, in films, where women appear only at the edges, where the story belongs entirely to kings and warriors and the clash of armies. That version is not just incomplete. It is missing the people who held the entire civilization together. Zulu women were not passive figures in the background of a male story. They were the architects of daily life, the carriers of cultural memory, the spiritual anchors of the homestead, and in many cases the political forces that shaped decisions no formal council ever officially recorded. Let's start with Lobola, because it is perhaps the most misunderstood institution in Zulu culture, and getting it wrong means misunderstanding everything that follows. Lobola is often translated into English as bride price, as if it were a transaction, a purchase, a commercial exchange in which a woman was valued in cattle and handed from one family to another. This translation is not just inadequate. It is, in a meaningful sense, the opposite of what Lobola actually was. Lobola was a bond between families. When a man's family gave cattle to a woman's family, they were not buying her. They were entering into a permanent relationship of mutual obligation with her family, a relationship that would outlast the marriage itself, that would bind the two families together through the children born of the union, through future ceremonies, through grief and celebration across generations. The cattle moved, but the relationship they created was far more valuable than any herd. If the marriage ended, the cattle were renegotiated, not simply returned. The relationship was adjusted, not erased. Lobola gave women a form of security that the transactional translation completely obscures. A woman whose husband treated her badly knew that her family's cattle, and by extension her family's honor, were embedded in that marriage. She was not alone. She was backed. Within the homestead, the senior wife, Inkosakazi, held authority that was real and recognized. She managed the household economy. She decided how food was stored and distributed. She oversaw the labor of the homestead with an organizational authority that no one, including her husband, casually overrode. In royal households, the Inkosakazi was a political figure in her own right. Her counsel sought, her approval meaningful in ways that courtly ceremonies made visible to anyone watching. Women controlled the production and distribution of uchwala, sorghum beer. This sounds like a domestic detail until you understand that beer was the lubricant of every significant social and political gathering. Negotiations between families, community decisions, ceremonial proceedings, all of them ran on uchwala that women brewed, women served, and women could withhold. The power to provide or deny that social lubricant was not trivial. Beadwork was a female art form, and in Zulu culture it was also a language, literally. Different colors of beads carried specific meanings. Specific patterns communicated specific messages. A young woman could send a beaded message to a young man that conveyed, with precision and privacy, what she felt and what she expected. A mother could bead a garment for her child that carried a blessing in its pattern. The vocabulary of Zulu beadwork was extensive enough and nuanced enough that colonial scholars spent decades studying it without fully decoding it, because the meanings shifted by region, by family, and by the hand of the maker. Women were also the primary connection to the spiritual world in everyday Zulu life. The Izangoma, the diviners who communicated with ancestor spirits, were predominantly women. This was not a peripheral role. In a worldview where illness, misfortune, conflict, and drought were all understood as spiritual communications that required interpretation and response, the Izangoma were among the most important people in any community. A chief consulted his Izangoma before making significant decisions. A family facing illness called their Izangoma before any other intervention. Women, in this role, held a form of authority that no warrior's reputation could simply override. Then there is Nandi, the mother of Shaka. A woman whose story is told, when it is told at all, primarily as a footnote to her son's biography. This is a profound injustice to a life that was, in its own right, one of the most remarkable in Southern African history. Nandi was a woman who was rejected by her husband's clan, mocked by her own, driven from homestead to homestead with a small child that the world had decided was inconvenient. She did not disappear. She did not accept the verdict that had been handed to her. She found refuge, built a life, kept her son alive, and transmitted to him, through the years of exile, through the years of mockery, through every door that was closed in their faces, a sense of identity and worth that survived everything the world threw at it. Whatever Shaka became, and he became things both extraordinary and terrible, the part of him that refused to accept other people's definitions of his worth came directly from his mother. The child who grows up watching a woman refuse to be erased does not easily accept erasure himself. Nandi died in 1827, a year before her son's assassination. Shaka's grief at her death was, by every account, staggering. So total and so consuming that it alarmed even his closest advisors. He mourned in ways that disrupted the entire kingdom. Whether that mourning was purely personal grief or something closer to a psychological collapse of the identity she had anchored for him. Historians still debate. But the depth of it speaks to what she had been to him, not a footnote, the foundation. Zulu women, across the centuries, were exactly that. Not decorative, not peripheral, not waiting at the edges of the story for the men to finish. They were the ground everything else was built on. And any telling of Zulu history that forgets that is not really telling Zulu history at all. In the Zulu language, there is no word that translates cleanly as religion. This is not a gap in the language. It is a statement about how the Zulu understood the relationship between the sacred and the everyday. In the Western framework, religion is a category, a defined set of beliefs and practices that occupies a specific portion of life, separate from work, from politics, from the mundane rhythms of eating and sleeping and tending cattle. For the Zulu, no such separation existed. The spiritual world was not somewhere else. It was here, layered over and through and underneath the visible world, in a way that required constant attention, constant relationship, and constant communication. The ancestors did not depart when they died. They shifted into a different mode of presence. They became amadlozi, spirits who retained their personalities, their preferences, their relationships with the living, and their capacity to intervene in the affairs of those they had left behind. An ancestor who was honored and remembered remained a source of protection and guidance. An ancestor who was neglected, whose name was not spoken at ceremonies, whose appetite for ritual recognition was not fed, could become a source of misfortune. Not out of malice, exactly. Out of hunger. Out of the deep human need, which apparently did not end at death, to be remembered. This meant that every significant event in Zulu life, birth, initiation, marriage, illness, drought, harvest, death, required an acknowledgement of the ancestors, not as a formality, as a genuine relational act. You were not going through motions. You were maintaining a relationship with your dead the way you maintained relationships with your living, with attention, with gifts, with conversation, with the expectation that the relationship was mutual. The Umsebenzi ceremony was perhaps the most significant regular expression of this relationship. Translated loosely as the work, it was a family gathering convened whenever the ancestors made their presence felt through signs, an unusual illness that did not respond to ordinary treatment, a run of misfortune that seemed to have no rational explanation, a dream in which a deceased relative appeared and communicated something that the dreamer could not ignore. The Umsebenzi involved the slaughter of an animal, usually a cow or a goat, whose blood and contents were offered to the ancestors, whose spirit was invited to return briefly to the homestead, and whose meat fed the gathered family in a meal that was simultaneously practical and sacred. The Izangoma were the specialists who navigated this relationship professionally. Predominantly women, though not exclusively, they were individuals who had been called to their role through a specific illness called ukuthwasa, a period of physical and psychological crisis understood as the ancestors reaching out to claim someone for spiritual service. The ukuthwasa illness did not respond to ordinary treatment. It required initiation into the Izangoma practice, a long, demanding apprenticeship under an established diviner that transformed suffering into capacity. An Izangoma communicated with the ancestors through multiple channels. Throwing the bones, ukufonsa amathambo, was perhaps the most visible practice, in which a collection of objects including animal bones, shells, seeds, and carved figures were cast onto a mat and read for the patterns they formed. But equally important was the ukuvumisa practice, a call-and-response diagnostic session in which the Izangoma made statements and the client responded, the diviner reading those responses with an attention to physical and emotional cues that amounted to a sophisticated form of psychological assessment. To call it merely fortune-telling is like calling surgery a knife trick. The Izinyanga, the herbalists, worked alongside the Izangoma, but with a different emphasis. Where the Izangoma diagnosed the spiritual dimension of a problem, the Izinyanga addressed the physical, with an extensive pharmacological knowledge of local plants, animal products, and mineral compounds that represented generations of accumulated medical understanding. The umuthi, medicine, prepared by skilled Izinyanga, was not superstition. Modern pharmacological research has confirmed the biological activity of many plants used in traditional Zulu medicine, including compounds with genuine antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, and analgesic properties. The Zulu also recognized a supreme creative force, uNkulunkulu, the Ancient One, the first being, the source from which existence emerged. But uNkulunkulu was not a deity in the interventionist sense. He had created the world and then receded from it. He did not answer prayers or respond to ceremony. The beings who responded, the beings who were present, interested, and reachable, were the ancestors. This cosmology created a world that was densely inhabited. Every significant tree, river crossing, and hilltop had a spiritual dimension. Every unusual animal behavior carried potential meaning. The world was not a collection of inert objects moving through mechanical processes. It was a living conversation between the visible and the invisible, between the present and the past, between the living and the dead who had not really gone anywhere. Colonial missionaries who arrived in Zulu territory in the 19th century looked at all of this and saw superstition, primitive confusion that enlightened Christianity would clear away like mist in morning sun. What they were actually looking at was a coherent, sophisticated, centuries-old system for maintaining community well-being, processing grief, explaining misfortune, making collective decisions, and keeping the living in conscious relationship with everything that had come before them. It was not confused. It was, if you took the time to understand it on its own terms, genuinely deep. In Zulu society, you were never raised by your parents alone. You were raised by everyone. The homestead, the extended family network, the neighbors across the next hill, all of them participated in the formation of a child in ways that the modern Western concept of nuclear family parenting does not fully prepare you to imagine. A child who wandered into a neighboring umuzi was fed, corrected if needed, and sent home at dusk without anyone considering this unusual. The community's children were, in a meaningful sense, the community's children. Birth itself was surrounded by ritual from the very first moment. A newborn was not simply born and named immediately. There was a period of seclusion. Mother and child kept close, protected, while the family observed the new life and prepared the ceremonies that would formally introduce it to the world, and crucially, to the ancestors. The naming of a child was a serious act. Names in Zulu culture carried meaning, sometimes reflecting the circumstances of the birth, sometimes honoring an ancestor, sometimes making a statement about the world the child had arrived into. A name was not decorative. It was a declaration. Childhood was organized around contribution from a remarkably early age, not as exploitation, but as integration. Small children followed older siblings. Older siblings followed adults. Everyone was always moving toward the next level of competence and responsibility, and the movement felt natural because it was always supervised and always supported. For girls, the path led through the homestead. Learning to carry water on the head without spilling, a skill requiring balance, posture, and calm that took months to develop properly. Learning to grind grain, to tend fire, to read the signs that told you when the amasi was ready and when it needed more time. Learning beadwork. First the simple patterns, then the complex ones, then the ones that carried messages only certain eyes were meant to read. This was not just domestic training, it was cultural transmission. Every skill a girl learned from her mother and her aunts was a thread in the fabric of Zulu identity. For boys, the cattle were the classroom. From the time a boy was old enough to run reliably, he was out on the hillside with the herd. He learned the name and temperament of every animal. He learned to read the grass, which patches were good, which were overgrazed, when it was time to move. He learned to use a stick with accuracy and confidence, not as a weapon primarily, but as the primary tool of a herdsman managing large animals across open terrain. He learned, alongside other boys, The first lessons of collective responsibility. That the herd belonged to the family. That a boy who lost an animal through carelessness had not just made a mistake, he had failed a relationship. The transition from childhood to adulthood was not a birthday. It was a ceremony, a deliberate, community-witnessed crossing of a threshold that made the change real in ways that a simple change of age never could. For girls, the onset of puberty, ukutomba, triggered a period of seclusion, instruction, and ceremony. Older women gathered around the young woman and transmitted knowledge about her body, about her new status, about the responsibilities and powers that came with womanhood. She emerged from this seclusion changed in the eyes of the community. She was dressed differently, addressed differently, expected differently. The community's recognition of her new status was not optional. It was the mechanism by which the status became real. For boys, the entry into an ibutho, an age regiment, was the defining social event of young manhood. When the king or chief called a new regiment into being, young men of similar age from across the territory came together and were formally constituted as a unit. They were given a name, a specific set of decorative distinctions, and a collective identity that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. What the regiment created was brotherhood. And this is not a word to use lightly here. These young men ate together, trained together, competed together, and supported each other through the years of their service. They were prohibited from marrying until the king granted the regiment permission, a collective permission given to the entire unit simultaneously, often after years of service. This meant that the regiment's shared experience, their shared sacrifice, their shared waiting, all of it bonded them in a way that no individual relationship could replicate. Old men in Zulu communities, well into the 20th century, would still identify themselves first by their regiment name before any other social affiliation, decades after the regiment's active service had ended. Because that identity, forged in youth, tested in shared experience, was simply that deep. The elders, Amadora, the men, but used to mean the senior men whose age had transformed them from actors into advisors, held a particular kind of authority in Zulu society that was distinct from political power. They were the living libraries, the men who remembered what had happened before and why, whose memory of precedent and tradition was the community's primary reference for navigating new situations. An elder who spoke at a community gathering was not just expressing an opinion. He was transmitting accumulated knowledge, linking the present moment to every similar moment that had come before it, reminding the community that it was not inventing itself from scratch, but continuing something that had been carefully built. In Zulu society, growing up was not something that happened to you. It was something the entire community did together, with intention, with ceremony, with the understanding that every child who became a capable adult was a victory that belonged to everyone who had participated in their formation. That's a whole different way of thinking about what a community is for. Every civilization has a voice, a specific, irreducible way of expressing itself that cannot be fully translated into any other language or cultural frame without losing something essential in the process. The Zulu voice is one of the most distinctive on Earth. isiZulu, the Zulu language, belongs to the Bantu language family, and within that family it sits among the Nguni languages alongside isiXhosa, Siswati, and isiNdebele. But knowing its linguistic category tells you almost nothing about what it actually sounds like or what it feels like to hear it spoken well. isiZulu is a tonal language, meaning that the pitch at which a syllable is spoken changes its meaning entirely. The same sequence of sounds, delivered at a different pitch, becomes a different word, sometimes with a radically different meaning. This tonal dimension gives fluent isiZulu speakers a musical relationship with their own language that is audible even to people who do not understand a single word. It sounds, to an outside ear, like the language is always on the verge of becoming song. And in a meaningful sense, that is precisely the truth. The language also incorporates click consonants, 3 distinct clicks borrowed historically from interaction with Khoisan-speaking peoples. that give isiZulu a percussive, physical quality that makes it unlike almost any language you have ever heard if you did not grow up around it. Hearing a fluent isiZulu speaker move through a sentence that incorporates multiple clicks and tonal shifts, and the language's characteristic rolling vowel sounds is, genuinely, a sonic experience. But the highest expression of the Zulu voice was not everyday conversation. It was izibongo, praise poetry. Izibongo is one of the oldest and most sophisticated oral literary traditions in Africa. Every significant person, a chief, a warrior of distinction, a woman of great character, accumulated izibongo over the course of their life. These were not simple, flattering descriptions. They were complex, layered compositions that used metaphor, historical reference, rhythm, and imagery to capture the essential nature of a person, their achievements, their character, their relationships, their contradictions. A skilled imbongi, praise poet, was a figure of real social power. They performed at ceremonies, at royal gatherings, at moments of community significance. They could move a crowd to tears or to laughter. They could make a powerful man feel the weight of his responsibilities or the shame of his failures, in public, in front of everyone, in ways that no direct accusation could achieve without triggering a confrontation. The imbongi spoke truth sideways, through image and metaphor, and everyone understood what was being said. The izibongo of Shaka, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down by scholars in the 20th century, runs to hundreds of lines. It is by turns awe-inspiring and deeply ambivalent, acknowledging his power while not flinching from his capacity for destruction. It is not a hymn of pure praise. It is a complex literary portrait. The Zulu tradition of izibongo had room for that complexity in ways that simpler commemorative traditions do not. Music in Zulu culture was not entertainment in the modern sense of a thing you consume while sitting still. It was participatory, communal, and functionally integrated into every significant activity. Work songs accompanied grinding, weaving, planting. Ceremonial songs marked transitions, births, initiations, weddings, funerals. Lullabies carried the oldest melodies, the ones so deeply embedded in the culture that they were learned before language itself was fully formed. The umakweyana, a mouthbow played predominantly by women, produced a haunting, intimate sound that carried surprisingly far across the open hills. The isigki, percussion instruments made from animal skin and wood, provided the rhythmic foundation for communal dance. Voices, always, were the primary instrument. Ukusina, Zulu dance, is worth understanding as something far beyond performance. The high kicks, the synchronized stomping, the call and response between dancers and singers. These were not primarily aesthetic choices. They were communication. Between the dancers and the community watching, between the living and the ancestors who were believed to be drawn to ceremony, to music, to the sound and feeling of their descendants moving in coordinated joy. When a Zulu dance performance raises the hair on your arms, and if you have ever seen one done properly, it does, that physical response is not accidental. It is the point. The dance is designed to move the body of the witness, to cross the boundary between performer and audience and make everyone present feel, physically, that they are part of something larger than themselves. Beadwork, as mentioned earlier, carried its own visual language, and the sophistication of that language deserves more than a passing reference. The colors of beads carried meanings that varied by region and by the relationship between maker and recipient. White could signify purity or spiritual openness. Black could mean marriage or, in certain patterns, a sorrow being communicated. Red, blue, green, yellow. Each had semantic weight that a fluent reader of beadwork could parse as accurately as a written note. A young woman sending a beaded message to a young man she was interested in was not being coy or decorative. She was communicating in a fully developed language that their culture had created specifically for that kind of precise private expression. The message had grammar, it had nuance, it had the capacity for double meaning and poetic suggestion. That is not primitive. That is, honestly, kind of genius. The Zulu voice, in language, in poetry, in music, in dance, in beadwork, was the sound of a people who had developed, across centuries, an extraordinarily rich set of tools for saying who they were, what they valued, and what they felt. The British would try in time to silence that voice. They would not succeed. Before there was a king, there was a mother. And before there was a mother, there was a choice. Made under pressure, made without certainty, made in the face of a community that had already decided this woman and her child were a problem to be managed rather than people to be supported. Nandi of the Elanjeni clan made that choice every single day for years. The choice to stay, the choice to keep going, the choice to refuse the verdict that had been handed to her. Her story begins with a relationship that violated social protocol. Her relationship with Senzangakona, chief of the small Zulu clan, produced a pregnancy outside the boundaries of what ukulobanga, the sanctioned form of non-penetrative intimacy between unmarried people, was supposed to allow. When Nandi's pregnancy became visible, the Elanjeni elders initially dismissed it as a parasitic condition. The Shaka intestinal beetle, they said. The insult was formal and deliberate. They were not confused. They were making a social judgment. When the child was born and could no longer be explained away, Senzangakona took Nandi as a junior wife, reluctantly, resentfully, in the way that a man takes on an obligation he wishes had never presented itself. The welcome was cold. The position was precarious. And the small boy growing up inside the Zulu homestead absorbed all of it. The sideways looks, the whispered qualifications about his legitimacy, the awareness, felt before it was fully understood, that his presence was considered a complication rather than a gift. He was mocked for his mother's status, for his own uncertain standing, for the circumstances of his birth that he had no part in choosing. Children's cruelty is rarely original. It goes straight for whatever the community has already decided is shameful. And the community had decided that Nandi and her son were shameful. Eventually, the tension became untenable. Nandi and the boy she had named Shaka, reclaiming the insult, turning it into an identity, were sent away from the Zulu homestead. They returned to the Elanjeni, and were mocked there too, for being the unwanted remnants of a Zulu connection that had not worked out. Think about what that period of life does to a child. Not in abstract psychological terms, but concretely. Waking up every morning in a community that has made its feelings about your existence clear. Watching your mother absorb the same rejection while refusing to collapse under it. Learning, because you had no other choice, to read the social dynamics of every room you entered, to assess threat and opportunity simultaneously, to build an inner world robust enough to survive the contempt of the outer one. This is the formation that produced Shaka's particular genius. Not military training, though that came later. Not physical development, though he was by all accounts exceptional in that regard too. It was this, the education of a boy who belonged nowhere and therefore could see everything with the clarity that outsiders develop when the system has given them no incentive to accept its assumptions. Eventually, Nandi found refuge with the Mthethwa, the larger, more powerful chiefdom of Dingiswayo. And it was here that the trajectory of Shaka's life began to shift. Dingiswayo was a chief of unusual breadth. He had traveled. He had observed. He recognized in the young man Nandi had raised a quality of mind that distinguished him from his peers, and he cultivated it. Under Dingiswayo, Shaka became a soldier, and he was, from the beginning, the kind of soldier who could not stop asking why. Why did warfare work this way? Why did these weapons have this shape? Why did men fight from a distance when the purpose was, ultimately, to achieve an outcome? He watched the ritual-throwing spear engagements with the expression of someone who was looking at an elegant system and thinking, there is something fundamentally wrong with this. But the military innovations would come later. What Shaka carried with him from those years of exile, from Nandi's example, from the long education of not belonging, was something that shaped everything he would eventually build. He understood, at a cellular level, what it meant to be dismissed, and he understood that the only permanent answer to dismissal was to build something so undeniable that dismissal became impossible. When Senzangakona died and a succession struggle opened a path back to the Zulu chieftaincy, Dingiswayo backed Shaka. Around 1816, he returned, not as the boy the Zulu clan had discarded, as a chief, backed by a powerful patron, carrying ideas that no one in the region had encountered before. He was, by most estimates, in his late 20s. He moved immediately. The Amabutho system was reorganized. Weapons were redesigned. Training intensified beyond anything that had previously existed. The social fabric of the Zulu clan was rewoven around military service in ways that created a new collective identity, one that absorbed the dozens of smaller clans Shaka's forces overcame, giving their people not just a new political authority to submit to, but a new identity to inhabit. This was, in its way, an act of profound cultural engineering. Shaka was not merely building an army. He was building a nation, a unified Zulu identity that transcended the clan affiliations that had previously divided the region into dozens of competing fragments. Nandi lived to see most of it. She lived to see the boy that no homestead had wanted become the ruler that Southern Africa could not ignore. Whether she felt vindication, that particular deep satisfaction of having been proved right about something the world dismissed, history does not record in her own words. She left no writings. Her voice comes to us only through the oral tradition and through the grief of the son who outlived her by barely a year. She died in 1827. Shaka was assassinated in 1828. They had walked the same difficult road together for almost his entire life, and when she left it, something in him appears to have come unmoored in ways that even his closest advisors could not fully understand or manage. That is not a political observation. That is not a military assessment. That is simply the story of a son who had loved his mother with the specific total intensity of someone who knows, from experience, that not everyone who should stand by you will. She had stood by him, and the world he built, extraordinary and complicated and permanently marked by both her love and his wounds, stands as the most complete answer he ever gave to the people who told them both, from the very beginning, that they did not belong. Before Shaka changed everything, war in southern Africa looked almost nothing like what the word conjures in the modern imagination. It is worth pausing here, genuinely pausing, to understand what conflict meant in the Nguni world before the 19th century. Because the image of African warfare as perpetual, brutal, and inevitable is itself a colonial construction, a narrative that served specific political purposes and bears very little resemblance to the actual historical record. The Nguni-speaking clans of what is today KwaZulu-Natal did not live in a state of constant warfare. They lived in a state of complex, dynamic relationship, with each other, with the land, with the cattle that moved between them as currency and social bond. Conflict existed, but it existed within a framework of rules, purposes, and limitations that kept it from becoming the total, civilization-ending enterprise that modern warfare implies. When disputes arose between clans, and they arose over the things that disputes always arise over, cattle, grazing rights, access to water, a perceived insult that required a visible response, the first recourse was not violence. It was negotiation. Elders from both communities met. Uchwala was shared. The grievance was stated, debated, and if possible, resolved through a transfer of cattle or a formal acknowledgement that repaired the damaged relationship. Only when negotiation failed, when one party refused to engage, or when the offense was considered too serious for cattle to address, did the option of physical confrontation become thinkable. And even then, the confrontation followed rules. Young men met on an agreed field. They brought their throwing spears and their shields. They hurled insults and projectiles at each other from a distance that made serious injury unlikely, though not impossible. Blood was sometimes drawn. Deaths occasionally happened. But the goal was demonstration, a public performance of strength and grievance that shifted the balance of prestige between the two groups without annihilating either of them. After the display, life continued. Cattle might change hands. A formal acknowledgement might be made. The relationship between the two clans, bruised but not severed, would resume within the shared web of kinship and trade and intermarriage that connected everyone to everyone else. This system worked because everyone in it understood something important: that your enemy today was your trading partner last season and your in-law next generation. Annihilating them solved the immediate problem while creating 20 future ones. Restraint was not weakness. It was wisdom encoded in social practice across generations. The weapons themselves reflected this philosophy perfectly. The long-throwing assegai was designed for distance, its length and balance optimized for a throw across open space, not for the close work of a killing intent on leaving no survivors. You threw it. Your opponent dodged it or deflected it. Someone might get nicked. A point was made. The throwing spear was a conversation conducted at a safe distance. Shaka looked at this system, the whole elegant, restrained, relationship-preserving tradition of Nguni conflict management, and made a deliberate choice to step outside it. His reasons were understandable. He had experienced what happened to people who played by the old rules in a world that was changing around them. He had watched his mother and himself be rendered vulnerable by a system that offered no protection to those it had already decided were inconvenient. But understanding why he stepped outside the old rules does not erase what was lost when he did. A system that had kept communities intact across generations, that had found a way to express grievance without seeking annihilation, was dismantled in the space of a decade. The old way of conflict had been, in its own measured fashion, one of the most humane approaches to inevitable human disagreement that the region had ever developed. It deserved better than to be forgotten entirely. What Shaka built was not just an army. That framing, Shaka as military genius, Shaka as warrior king, Shaka as the man who transformed warfare, is accurate as far as it goes. But it stops at the surface of something much more significant. The military innovations were the visible edge of a project that was, at its deepest level, about identity, about what it meant to be Zulu, about the creation of a national consciousness where only clan affiliations had existed before. When Shaka's forces defeated a neighboring clan, the standard practice of the era would have been to take the cattle, accept submission, and move on, leaving the defeated people as a separate group with a new political obligation but the same old identity. Shaka did something different. He absorbed them, completely. The people of defeated clans were incorporated into the Zulu Nation, not as second-class subjects but as Zulu, full participants in the regimental system, the ceremonial life, the shared identity that Shaka was continuously constructing. This was an act of extraordinary political creativity. By making Zulu identity available to anyone willing to adopt it, regardless of their birth clan, Shaka created a mechanism for rapid national expansion that did not depend entirely on military conquest. You could become Zulu. And becoming Zulu meant joining something that, by the 1820s, had become genuinely compelling. The Amabuto regimental system was the engine of this identity construction. When young men from a dozen different formerly separate clans stood together in the same regiment, shared the same food, trained under the same expectations, received the same honors and the same disciplines, they did not remain the collection of separate clan identities they had been at arrival. They became something new. The regiment was their primary affiliation. The Zulu Nation was their home. Their birth clan became a secondary identity, remembered, honored in family ceremony, but no longer the organizing center of their social world. This is, from a political science perspective, one of the most effective processes of national identity creation in African history. Shaka essentially built, from scratch, in a decade, the kind of national consciousness that most societies take centuries to develop. And he built it not through propaganda but through the lived experience of shared belonging. The administrative structure of the Zulu kingdom was equally sophisticated. Shaka established a network of royal amakanda, royal homesteads, distributed across the kingdom's territory. These were not just military bases, though they functioned as regimental headquarters. They were administrative centers, economic hubs, and symbols of royal presence across the landscape. To live near an ikanda was to be physically reminded, every day, that you were part of something larger than your local hillside. Trade was managed with increasing sophistication as the kingdom expanded. The Zulu had contact with Portuguese traders on the coast and, eventually, with British merchants at Port Natal. Ivory, cattle, and other goods moved through networks that Shaka's central authority helped organize and protect. The kingdom was not economically isolated. It was actively engaged with the wider commercial world on terms that Shaka worked to manage in the Zulu interest. What is perhaps most striking from a tribal and cultural perspective is that all of this, the military innovation, the national identity construction, the administrative network, was accomplished while the deep structures of Zulu cultural life remained intact. The Amadlozi ancestor ceremonies continued. The Izingoma practiced their craft. The Izibaya cattle enclosure remained the spiritual center of every homestead. The Izibongo praise poets performed at every significant gathering. The Utshwala beer flowed at every community event. Shaka reorganized the political and military structure of Zulu society without dismantling its cultural and spiritual foundations. He understood, intuitively, practically, that a nation's identity lives in its ceremonies, its language, its daily rituals, not in its political arrangements. Change the politics, keep the culture. The people will follow, because the thing they are actually attached to has not been taken from them. This is why the Zulu Nation proved so durable, not because Shaka's military innovations were so effective, though they were, but because the identity he crystallized was rooted in something much older and much deeper than any one man's genius. He gave the Zulu a frame for understanding who they were. But the picture inside that frame had been painted across centuries by the women who kept the ceremonies, the elders who carried the oral histories, the Izangoma who maintained the relationship with the ancestors, the Izibongo poets who kept the language alive to its own highest possibilities. Shaka provided the structure. The people provided the soul. And a structure with soul is, it turns out, extraordinarily difficult to destroy. History, when it is written from above, from the perspective of kings and campaigns and the movement of armies across maps, can make large human catastrophes feel almost abstract. Thousands displaced, hundreds of thousands affected, entire regions restructured. Numbers like that slide past the mind without fully landing. So let's bring it down to a single family, a single homestead, a single morning when the world that had always been there was suddenly, irrevocably, gone. Imagine a woman. Let's call her by the kind of name that would have been common in the Mthethwa or Hlubi clans of the early 1820s. She wakes before dawn, as she always does, to tend the fire and begin the morning meal. Her children are asleep on their mats. Her husband is out with the cattle. Her mother-in-law is in the next hut, already stirring, already beginning the quiet rhythms that have organized every morning of her adult life. Then someone arrives at the homestead at a run, breathing hard, eyes wide. And the word they bring is the word that has been moving across the hills for weeks, that Shaka's forces are coming, that the Next Valley's clan has already scattered, that there is no time for negotiation and no point in resistance. What do you take? You cannot take the cattle. They will slow you down and mark you as a target. You cannot take the grain stores. Too heavy. You take your children. You take whatever food you can carry in your arms. You take the beadwork your mother gave you on your wedding day because it is small and it is the most irreplaceable thing you own. And you walk, away from the umuzi your husband's grandfather built, away from the Isibaya where your family's ancestors are believed to reside, away from the graves of your children who did not survive infancy, the ones you buried with ceremony under specific trees whose locations you will never see again. You walk north, or west, whichever direction is away. This story, with local variations, with different details, with different endings both terrible and surprisingly hopeful, played out across tens of thousands of families during the period historians call the Mfecane, the crushing, the scattering. The Hlubi were pushed northward into territory occupied by the Ngwane. The Ngwan were then pushed further. Each group, displaced and desperate, collided with the next. Some communities survived by fighting, some by fleeing faster. Some by finding leaders, like the remarkable Moshoshu of the Sotho people, who understood that geography could do what military force could not, and who consolidated their people onto the mountain fortress of Thababosyu in what is today Lesotho, where they held out and against every reasonable expectation survived. Others carried Zulu-influenced culture with them as they moved. The Ndebele, under Mzilikazi, a former general of Shaka's who broke with the king after a dispute over cattle tribute and led his people on an extraordinary multi-year march across the Highveld, eventually settled in what is today Zimbabwe. There, they built their own kingdom, organized on Zulu military principles, retaining Zulu ceremonial practices, speaking a language that carried Zulu influence. Their descendants live there today, 2 centuries later, still bearing the cultural fingerprints of a kingdom they left in the 1820s. The Ngoni groups moved even further, carrying Zulu-derived practices all the way into present-day Tanzania and Malawi, where their descendants still maintain distinct identities, still perform ceremonies whose origins lie in a valley in KwaZulu-Natal that most of them have never seen. The Mfecane reshaped the human geography of sub-Saharan Africa in ways that are still visible. National boundaries drawn by colonial powers in the 19th century cut across the migration patterns and settlement distributions that the Mfecane had created, producing the complex ethnic and political landscapes that post-colonial African states have navigated ever since. The question of Shaka's responsibility for the Mfecane is one that historians continue to debate with genuine heat. More recent scholarship has argued, compellingly, that earlier accounts overstated both the death toll and Shaka's specific role, and that the simultaneous expansion of European colonial settlement created disruptions that were attributed entirely to Shaka, because it served colonial narratives to have a single African villain responsible for the region's instability. The truth appears to be more complex. The Mfecane was real. The displacement was real. The human suffering was real. And Shaka's expansion was a significant cause, not the only cause, but a real one. This complexity does not diminish Shaka. It humanizes him. Extraordinary people do not operate in moral simplicity. They make choices under pressure, with imperfect information, for reasons that are understandable even when the consequences are devastating. The woman walking north with her children and her mother's beadwork is not less real because the man whose decisions set her walking was also, by other measures, a genius. Both things are true. History is almost always both things at once. The British did not arrive in Zulu territory as conquerors, initially. They arrived as traders, as missionaries, as curious men with notebooks and an unshakable conviction that the civilization they carried inside their heads was the highest one the world had yet produced, and that the civilizations they encountered along the way would, given time and proper guidance, gratefully recognize this and align themselves accordingly. That conviction was not malicious in the minds of most of the individuals who held it. It was simply, completely, and dangerously wrong. The first sustained British contact with the Zulu kingdom occurred during Shaka's own reign. A small group of British traders established themselves at Port Natal, later renamed Durban, in the 1820s, with Shaka's permission. He received their delegation personally and found the encounter more entertaining than threatening. These men, with their strange clothes and their nervous energy and their elaborate rituals around written documents, were, to Shaka, a curiosity. Interesting. Potentially useful as a source of specific trade goods, particularly blankets and beads, not a challenge to anything that mattered. He gave them land. He granted them access. He was, by the accounts of the British traders themselves, unexpectedly warm and intermittently terrifying, a combination that apparently left the delegation somewhat off balance. But Shaka was not wrong in his initial assessment. At that moment, in the 1820s, the British presence at Port Natal was exactly what it appeared to be: a small, commercially motivated outpost with no political ambitions beyond maintaining a profitable relationship with the most powerful kingdom in the region. The ambitions came later. By the 1840s and 1850s, the broader shape of British colonial intention in southern Africa was becoming clearer. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley in 1867 and gold in the Transvaal in subsequent years transformed the economic calculus entirely. Southern Africa was no longer a moderately interesting region on the way to somewhere more important. It was one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth, and the British, who had been steadily accumulating colonial territory across the globe for 2 centuries, intended to control it. King Cetshwayo Kampande, who came to power in 1872, understood what was happening with clarity and intelligence. He was a man who had navigated the complex internal politics of Zulu succession, and those politics were genuinely dangerous, and emerged as a leader of considerable sophistication. Contemporary British accounts, even those written by people who considered him an obstacle to colonial progress, consistently described him as intelligent, dignified, and politically astute. Cetshwayo did not want war with Britain. This is not a revisionist reframing. It is what the historical record shows. He sent multiple diplomatic communications to British authorities throughout the 1870s, seeking to clarify the terms of the relationship, to resolve the border disputes that were creating tension, to find a political arrangement that would allow both the Zulu kingdom and British colonial interests to exist without armed collision. Those efforts were not met with reciprocal goodwill. They were met with escalating demands, land concessions, political submission, and finally, in December 1878, the ultimatum that Sir Henry Bartle Frere delivered with full knowledge that its terms were unacceptable. The ultimatum demanded, among other things, the immediate and complete disbandment of the Zulu military regimental system. Frere knew what he was asking. The Amabuto were not just soldiers. They were the organizational spine of Zulu society, the institution through which identity was formed, through which young men became adults, through which the nation maintained its coherence across generations. Dismantling them was not a military demand. It was a demand for cultural self-erasure. To comply would have been to hand over not just political sovereignty, but the social and cultural architecture that made Zulu society what it was. Cetshwayo could not comply, not because he was too proud or too stubborn, but because what was being demanded was genuinely not his to give. It belonged to the people. He did not comply. The British invasion began in January 1879. What strikes you, looking back at this moment from the distance of nearly 150 years, is the profound failure of imagination on the British side. Not a failure of intelligence. Many of the men involved were intelligent and well-educated, but a failure to imagine, fully and seriously, that the civilization on the other side of that ultimatum was a real civilization. That the Umuzi and the Isibaya and the Amadlozi ceremonies and the Izibongo praise poetry and the beadwork language and the cattle bonds and the age regiment brotherhoods, that all of this constituted a genuine human world worth the same moral consideration as anything Sheffield or Edinburgh had to offer. That failure of imagination was not unique to Southern Africa in 1879. It was the operating assumption of the entire colonial enterprise, applied with varying degrees of violence from one end of the colonized world to the other. But it was felt here, in this specific place, by these specific people, with a particular intensity. Because what the British were asking the Zulu to surrender was not territory, not trade rights, not political arrangements. It was themselves. January 22, 1879. A sphinx-shaped mountain called Izandlwana. A British camp spread across open ground below it, inadequately fortified, its commander away with a significant portion of the force chasing faulty intelligence in the wrong direction. And moving toward it, discovered by accident before their encirclement was complete, 20,000 Zulu warriors, seated in a valley in disciplined silence, prepared, committed, and fully aware of what they were fighting for. The battle itself lasted a few terrible hours. The British line held under fierce fire, then bent, then broke as the buffalo horn formation closed around both flanks simultaneously, and the ammunition supply, stored in heavy wooden crates, ran desperately short at the moment when sustained fire was most critical. By late afternoon, approximately 1,300 British and Allied soldiers were dead. The Zulu losses were also significant. The defenders fought hard and with genuine courage. But the outcome was unambiguous. The most powerful imperial army on Earth had been defeated in open engagement by men carrying spears. Now, this is the moment to step back from the military facts and ask the deeper question. The one that matters more for understanding who the Zulu were than any tactical analysis could provide. Who were these 20,000 men, really? They were fathers who had children sleeping in Isandlu back in the valleys of the Thukela and the White Mofolozi. They were brothers who had grown up together in Amabutho regiments, who had shared food and training and the long years of waiting for permission to marry and build homes of their own. They were sons of women who knew Izibongo by heart and had sung them at the ceremonies that marked every significant moment of their lives. They were members of communities that gathered at dusk around fires to drink uchwala and listen to elders recount the histories that connected the living to everyone who had come before. They were, in the fullest human sense of the word, people, and what they were defending at Isandlwana was not a king's political authority, though that was part of it. They were defending the right of everything described in this documentary to continue existing, the right of the Izangoma to practice their craft, the right of the Imbangi praise poet to perform at ceremonies, the right of a mother to beat a message to her daughter in a language that colonial administrators would never learn to read, the right of a boy to grow up knowing the name of every cow in the family herd and understanding what that knowledge meant. They were defending a way of being in the world that was, in every meaningful sense, worth defending. The British reaction to Isandlwana was, by all historical accounts, something close to collective shock. The story the empire told itself, about the natural order of things, about civilization and its opposites, about who was equipped to govern whom, took a serious blow on that hillside. The reinforcements that poured into southern Africa afterward were not just a military response, they were a psychological one. The narrative had to be restored. Rorke's Drift, the heroic overnight defense by roughly 150 British soldiers against several thousand Zulu warriors the same evening, was decorated with more Victoria Crosses than almost any engagement in British military history. The Empire needed that story, needed it urgently. But Isandlwana did not unhappen. And what it represented, a people saying with their bodies that this civilization, this identity, this way of life is worth everything, that did not unhappen either. Some stands are straight up unforgettable, and this was one of them. The British won the Anglo-Zulu War. By July 1879, the royal homestead at Ulundi was burned. Cetshwayo was captured, transported to Cape Town, and eventually taken to London, where Queen Victoria received him with an unexpected courtesy that her government's policies had entirely failed to extend to his kingdom. He was allowed to return to Zululand in 1883, but the kingdom he returned to had been deliberately fractured, divided by the British into 13 separate chieftaincies, each with its own chief, each a counterweight to the others, designed to ensure that unified Zulu political and military authority could never again exist. Cetshwayo died in 1884. The official cause was a heart condition. Some historians suspect poison. The question has never been definitively resolved. But the physical defeat of the Zulu kingdom, the military and political collapse, was only the most visible layer of what was taken in the decades that followed. The deeper taking was cultural. and it was conducted with a patient, systematic thoroughness that military conquest rarely achieves on its own. Christian missionaries had been present in Zulu territory since the 1830s. Their explicit goal was not just religious conversion, it was civilizational replacement. The replacement of Zulu cosmology, Zulu social organization, Zulu ceremony, and Zulu identity with European Christian equivalents that the missionaries believed were simply, objectively better. The Izangoma were targeted specifically. Their practices were characterized as witchcraft, a word that carried, in the colonial and missionary imagination, a freight of darkness and danger that bore no relationship to what the Izangoma actually did. The ceremonies were suppressed, the practitioners were driven underground. The knowledge that had been transmitted through careful, demanding apprenticeship across generations was disrupted, not eliminated, but fractured, made dangerous to practice openly, stripped of the social legitimacy that had allowed it to function fully. The Amabutho regimental system, the institution that had formed male identity, created brotherhood, and provided the social structure through which young men became adults, was formally dismantled. In its place, young Zulu men were pulled into the colonial labor economy, the diamond mines at Kimberley, the gold mines of the Rand. Work that was brutal, dangerous, and conducted on terms that bore no resemblance to the reciprocal obligations that had organized labor within Zulu society. Men who had been embedded in a dense web of community relationships, of obligations to regiment brothers, to family, to ancestors, to the chief, found themselves individually isolated in a wage economy, designed to extract labor as cheaply as possible, with no interest whatsoever in the human beings providing it. Children were educated in missionary schools where isiZulu was discouraged or forbidden in classrooms, where the oral histories that connected children to their ancestors were characterized as primitive fictions, where the Izibongo poetry that was the highest expression of Zulu literary culture was replaced with hymns and biblical recitations in a language, English, that had no relationship to anything the child's grandparents had known. This was not education. It was, in the most precise sense of the term, cultural replacement, the deliberate substitution of one civilization's knowledge system with another's, conducted on children too young to evaluate what was being done to them, and without the consent of the communities it was done to. What makes this particularly painful to sit with is that so much of what was targeted was irreplaceable. Knowledge systems that exist in living practice, in ceremony, in song, in the hands of practitioners, in the oral transmission between generations, are extraordinarily vulnerable to disruption. Break the chain of transmission for a generation, and what is lost is not easily reconstructed from books or archives, because it was never in books or archives. It lived in people. Some of those people refused to let it die. And that refusal is what the final chapter of this story is about. They could not kill it. They tried, with law, with mission school, with the deliberate fracturing of political authority, with the suppression of ceremony, with the criminalization of practices that had sustained Zulu communities across centuries. They tried with the patient, grinding pressure of a colonial system that had, by the late 19th century, refined cultural erasure into something close to an administrative science. And still, it survived. Not everywhere, not completely, not without loss that is real and permanent, and should be named honestly, but enough. Enough that what you encounter when you engage with Zulu culture today is not a reconstruction or a revival or a museum exhibit. It is a living tradition, battered, adapted, sometimes hybridized in ways that reflect everything the 20th century threw at it, but alive in the most important sense. Practiced by people for whom it is not performance, but identity. The Izangoma never stopped practicing. They went quiet when they needed to go quiet. They moved their ceremonies to times and places that drew less official attention. They taught their apprentices in conditions that were sometimes dangerous. And generation after generation, the knowledge moved forward, through women who had been called to their vocation through Ukuthwasa, who had completed their apprenticeship under conditions of real risk, who had decided that what they carried was worth the cost of carrying it. Today, izangoma practice openly across South Africa. They are consulted by politicians and business people and community members navigating grief and illness and decisions that carry weight. The South African government has, in recent decades, moved toward formal recognition of traditional healing practices, an acknowledgement, however incomplete, that the dismissal of the colonial era was wrong and that the knowledge systems it targeted were genuine. The Umkhosi Wokweshwama, the first fruit ceremony, a royal celebration of the harvest that was one of the most significant annual gatherings of the Zulu calendar, was banned under colonial and apartheid rule. It was revived in the late 20th century and is today celebrated annually at the Royal Palace at Nongoma in KwaZulu-Natal, drawing thousands of participants. The ceremony connects contemporary Zulu people to a practice that predates the colonial encounter by centuries. isiZulu is today spoken by approximately 12 million people, making it the most widely spoken home language in South Africa. It is taught in schools, broadcast on radio and television, used in political discourse, celebrated in literature, and, perhaps most significantly, still the primary language in which Zulu people speak to their children and their grandparents. The language was never lost. It carried, inside itself, everything the written record could not hold. The Izibongo praise poetry tradition continues. At the coronation of King Misuzulu Kazwelithini in 2022, following the death of the long-reigning King Goodwill Zwelithini, Izibongo was performed in the oldest tradition, connecting the new king to every king who had come before him, all the way back through Cetshwayo and Mpande and Dingane to Shaka himself. The chain of oral transmission, stretched and tested across 2 centuries, held. Zulu beadwork has been recognized by UNESCO as part of the world's intangible cultural heritage, an acknowledgement that the visual language carried in those colors and patterns is a genuine human achievement that belongs not just to the Zulu people, but to the collective inheritance of humanity. Nelson Mandela, himself a Xhosa speaker, from a different but related cultural tradition, spoke repeatedly about the importance of honoring the African civilizations that preceded the colonial encounter. He understood that the psychological work of recovery from colonial rule required, among other things, a reconnection to the knowledge that colonialism had tried to erase. You cannot build a genuinely post-colonial identity on the ruins of your own cultural memory. You need the memory itself. The Zulu Nation today is approximately 12 million people. They are urban and rural, traditional and modern, Christian and ancestor-honoring, and both simultaneously. They navigate every day the complex inheritance of a history that includes both extraordinary achievement and extraordinary suffering, the pride of Isandlwana and the grief of what came after, the genius of Shaka and the displacement of the Mafekan, the richness of the culture, and the deliberate damage done to it. They carry all of it, and they are still here, still dancing, still beating, still reciting Izibongo at ceremonies that connect the living to the dead in the way the Zulu have always understood that connection, not as metaphor, not as sentiment, but as actual relationship. The ancestors, as the Zulu have always said, never really left. They have been here the whole time. We began this story on a hillside, voices rising in the mist, a people speaking to their ancestors before the day had fully started, a civilization doing what it has done for centuries, reminding itself, through sound and breath and collective memory, of who it is and where it came from. That image is not a romantic opening device. It is the truest summary of everything this documentary has tried to say. The Zulu Nation is not a war story. It was never just a war story. It is a story about people who built something extraordinary on a particular piece of earth, a way of organizing community, of honoring the dead, of raising children, of speaking truth through poetry, of maintaining relationship with the land and with each other across generations. That something was attacked, diminished, partially broken, and it survived anyway. not perfectly, not without loss, but with enough life in it to reach all the way forward to this moment, to this screen, to your ears, to whatever this story stirred in you. If it stirred something, if you want to keep exploring the civilizations that the standard history curriculum forgot to tell you about, subscribe. There is so much more where this came from. The world is full of people who built remarkable things, and every single one of them deserves to be remembered.